Hi, and welcome to my first video on something other than Norse mythology. This video is going to be the first in a series about castles. I've always been fascinated by castles, from the architecture to the roles they played throughout society and the history of them. So in honor of Halloween this week, I knew the first one I needed to do was going to be the infamous Tower of London. The Tower of London has a long and rich history dating back nearly 1,000 years. Not only has it been a fortress for as long, but it's also been a luxurious residence for royalty with everything in between. It's been a prison, a vault, a mint, a menagerie, a records office, and an armory. First and foremost, the tower is located in London, obviously, on the north bank of the River Thames. Let's first go through and talk about the starting points in construction and the key additions throughout its long history. Construction was started on the tower by William the Conqueror in 1066, shortly after his reign began. He had just taken control of the city and needed to now keep control of it. To do this, he started what is now known as the White Tower on this strategic location of the Thames. It is strategic not only for its defensive position on the river, but also for its access to the city. This was crucial for William and what has kept the Tower of London so essential throughout time. One interesting fact is that parts of the surrounding circle wall are actually built utilizing old Roman walls. The White Tower was completed in 1100 during the reign of King William II, who was promptly assassinated by his brother, Henry I. Henry I took the throne, and here starts just one of the many roles of the tower: prison. He arrested the Bishop of Durham, Ranulph Flambard, for simony, which is the act of selling administrative positions in the church for money. While he was the first prisoner, he definitely wasn't the last. He didn't even stick around for his stay, as he later escaped. Some 90 years later, the first big spurt of growth occurred in expansion of the castle. In 1190, the first of many expansions started on the tower. This was for the bell tower that would ring to signal emergencies. This was completed in 1210. Concurrently, the wardrobe tower was under construction from 1190 to 1199. The purpose of this was storing not only the royal garments, but the crown jewels of England. Next to be constructed during the time of King Henry III were the Wakefield and Lanthorn towers in 1220. These had lanterns on them that were used to guide ships entering the river. Another infamous addition during the time of King Henry III is known as the Bloody Tower. It was constructed in the early 1220s and was originally known by another name, the Garden Tower. After countless brutal deaths, it gained its moniker that would stick. I'll talk more about some of the famous prisoners and deaths throughout the history later on. Around 1240, King Henry III was also responsible for whitewashing the central tower, giving it the name that we now know it by, the White Tower. Another role was then added, the Royal Menagerie. This acted as a zoo with animals such as lions, leopards, elephants, and even a polar bear from the time of Henry III, about 1264, until it was finally closed down in 1835. Greater additions to the tower began in the late 1200s during the time of Edward I. He added the double wall and the Watergate structures known as St. Thomas's Tower. These features give the castle the defining features familiar to us. Part of the inner defensive wall includes the Beauchamp Tower. This tower was known for housing the most high-ranking prisoners throughout the years. The Beauchamp Tower itself has an interesting history, some of which will be covered when talking about the prisoners in just a little bit. During the upcoming years is when the tower gained a few more roles: mint, armory, and barracks. Edward I started by first moving one of the royal treasuries to the tower so it became home of the royal archive. He then also built the kingdom's primary mint here as well. Because it was now holding the kingdom's most valuable assets, it also became where all of the best weapons and armor were both made and stored. Edward III ordered that all guards remain within the castle at night and all of the gates locked, effectively making it a barracks for the first time. So those were all the big booms of construction on the castle, and it has looked similar to what we know since. Throughout the years, there have been reworkings, whether it be due to a new king who wanted to make some changes, or destruction from war or fire, but it has largely remained as it was. Let's get into the juicy stuff. Aside from all of the many hats that the castle wears, it is best known for its role as a prison. There were numerous prisoners, but only around 400 were killed here. This is actually not a huge number considering its near 1,000-year history. Throughout time, it held many famous prisoners of every walk of life. So let's talk about a few of them now. Perhaps one of the most well-known prisoners was none other than the second wife of King Henry VIII, Anne Boleyn. She actually had the unfortunate experience of being at the Tower not once, but twice. While the first was under happier circumstances, the second was definitely not. The first was as a queen-to-be before her coronation in 1533, while the second time was on entirely different circumstances. After 3 years of marriage with no male heir and accusations of infidelity, King Henry VIII had Anne Boleyn locked up in the Tower in May 1536. While he accused her of seducing him into a cursed marriage, the official charges were of adultery. Anne was tried, found guilty, and beheaded on May 19, 1536. It's said that her ghost still roams the grounds of the castle today. Legend says she wanders around with her head under her arm. Henry's fifth wife, Catherine Howard, would end up in the same position, being imprisoned and then executed in 1542, also at the Tower. What a guy, that Henry. There will definitely be a dedicated video on him and his antics at some point in the future, so look out for that one. Another well-known name also interred at the Tower was Sir Walter Raleigh. He also had the displeasure of repeating a stay at the Tower, but neither of his stays was for good reason. The first would be a short stay in 1592 for secretly marrying one of Queen Elizabeth I's maids, Elizabeth Throckmorton. This was frowned upon as he was a courtier in her court and hadn't even asked her permission to do so. The second imprisonment was much more serious, and thus he ended up in the Bloody Tower for 13 years. This time, he was accused of plotting to kill the king, James I. He didn't let prison life keep him down, though. As he was high-ranking, his stay was cozy enough. His family lived with him, which allowed him to even have a son during this time. He also wrote his book, History of the World, during his stay. While he was released in 1616, his story does not end well. He was soon executed after a failed search for the mythical city of El Dorado ended with him attacking the Spanish against the orders of the king. So sad. Remember how I said Queen Elizabeth I imprisoned Sir Walter Raleigh? Well, you think she would be a little less prison happy considering she had to stay at the Tower herself during her princess days. Granted, it was in fact a short stay, and she would return only 5 years later for her coronation, but it did happen. Her sister, Queen Mary I, had her imprisoned when she believed that Elizabeth was plotting against her. Interestingly enough, Elizabeth stayed in the apartments once belonging to her mother, Anne Boleyn. What a small world, right? To add another link in the chain that is English royalty, we come to Lady Jane Grey. She is also known as the 9 Days Queen. Her reign came about when Edward XI, her first cousin once removed, installed her as his successor when his health began to fail at a very young age. See, he was a devout Protestant and wanted to prevent his Catholic half-sister, Mary, from taking the throne. Spoiler, this is Mary, as in Queen Mary I, the very same who would imprison the future Queen Elizabeth I that we just talked about. Jane became queen after Edward's death on July 10th, 1553. Her reign was so short, however, because more people preferred Mary. This is when Mary became queen and would soon imprison Elizabeth. Jane was promptly imprisoned in the Tower of London for treason in November 1553. She had a brief reprieve from imprisonment until she was again seen as a threat to the crown amidst growing strife toward Queen Mary. Jane's father participated in a Protestant rebellion, which then led to the executions of her and her husband at the Tower on February 12, 1554. An interesting bit of information about the stay of Jane, her husband, and his 4 brothers is how they left their mark on the Beauchamp Tower where they were held. You can still see the inscriptions left by them during their stay, as well as their family arms. After Jane and her husband, Guilford Dudley, were executed, the other 4 Dudley brothers were pardoned and released for their treason. Another infamous tale of the Bloody Tower, and possibly where the name originated, comes from the Princes of the Tower. The princes were 12-year-old Prince Edward V and 10-year-old Prince Richard of Shrewsbury. The boys arrived at the castle shortly after the death of their father, King Edward IX, and were promptly stripped of their titles by their very own uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. This uncle invalidated his brother's marriage, thus illegitimating the boys and cutting off their claim to the throne. He then became King Richard III. Their arrival was early 1483, and by mid-1483, the boys had vanished. They were no longer seen outside or in the tower. Unfortunately, in 1674, the skeletons of 2 children were found during one of the renovations of the tower. They were re-examined in 1933 and proven to be the skeletons of the poor princes of the tower. We don't know exactly how they met their gruesome end, but it is also said that the boys can be seen haunting the Bloody Tower where they spent their last few months. Guy Fawkes was a prisoner in the 1700s after his role in the gunpowder plot. He and his comrades planned to blow up a storage room full of gunpowder on November 5, 1605, during the opening of Parliament. Fortunately, his plan was foiled via anonymous letter. Fawkes was confined to a tiny cell in which he could neither lay down or stand up, in addition to being endlessly tortured. He eventually gave up the others in on the plan and was found guilty of treason. While he was sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, he instead opted to jump from the gallows and break his own neck to avoid being further tortured. November 5th ultimately became known as Guy Fawkes Day. The last regularly held prisoners were in 1660. The last 2 prisoners we'll talk about, however, are the exception to the rule and are from far more recent times. One was never officially a prisoner in the tower, although he was executed there. The first, Rudolf Hess, peach of a man, was second in command to Hitler of the Nazi Party. He was deputy to the Fuhrer. After the fall of the party, Hess decided his best option would be to parachute into Scotland and attempt to negotiate peace with the British. He was the last state prisoner to be held there. He only remained for a few days, but rumors that he remained there longer swelled for months. Hess was tried at Nuremberg along with all of his other pals and was given a life sentence for his crimes. The second, Joseph Jacobs, like the Tower, had many roles throughout his life: soldier, dentist, salesman, spy. In September 1940, Joseph went to Hamburg to be trained in espionage. He would travel home to Berlin on weekends to see his family, and it was during one of these trips that he told a friend of the plan he had: escape to America. The friend ratted him out to the Gestapo, and Joseph was sent back to Hamburg. He was still thought to be good spy material and was then sent on to The Hague on January 8, 1941, to be trained in wireless transmitting and receiving. On January 31st, 1941, Joseph was in an aircraft on his way to England when he decided it would be a good idea to parachute out of the plane despite never having trained for this. His ankle was injured upon landing, and after a series of unfortunate events for him, he ended up in custody. They were rightfully convinced that he was an enemy spy, which makes sense because he was found with suspicious items like a wireless transmitter, a torn-up code wheel, and fake papers. It was around this time that he developed a fever and sepsis, which ended him at the hospital for 2 months. He was then held for the next few months, being interrogated and giving his statements. Joseph was court-martialed and sent to Wandsworth Prison. After his hearing, he was found guilty on August 5, 1941. On August 15, 1941, he was executed by firing squad at the Tower of London, making him the last person ever executed at the Tower, as of now. Some say that he was held at the Tower the night before, but eyewitnesses have rebutted this by saying he was still in fact at Wandsworth. Upon ending regular function as a prison in 1660, that particular role was mostly cast off. However, a new role began: tourism. Prior to opening to the public for the first time, a garden was added to the grounds in 1506. This would become a beautiful attraction for tourists in later days. In the 1660s, the crown jewels were put on display, marking the beginning of tourism within the tower. Unfortunately, shortly before the crown jewels and royal regalia were put on display for tourism, much of the original regalia used in coronations was sold off after the execution of Charles I in 1649. However, some was recovered and some replacements were found that included recycled elements from the original pieces. Over time, priceless gemstones have continued to find their way into the collection, with almost 3,000 diamonds, several sapphires, including the Stuart sapphire and St. Edward's sapphire, emeralds, rubies, and even Queen Elizabeth I's pearl earrings. One such notable diamond currently on display is the huge 530-carat diamond known as the Star of Africa. During the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, the menagerie was open to the public for the first time. The menagerie had seen all sorts of animals since its inception around 1235, when King Henry III received 3 leopards and decided to start a zoo. Since, it has seen elephants, lions, polar bears, tigers, eagles, pumas, and many more things. It has also seen its fair share of accidents, with one notable example being that of Mary Jenkinson in 1686. The story goes that she was petting a lion's paw when it suddenly ripped her arm off. Mary died even after having her arm amputated. In addition, according to the 1810 guidebook, a monkey tore part of a boy's leg off, resulting in the monkeys being removed from the menagerie. The number of animals dwindled throughout the years, and there are accounts noting the poor treatment of the animals also throughout the years. Despite this, it was revitalized in the beginning of the 19th century when Alfred Copps, head keeper, acquired over 300 animals for the menagerie. It was said that he was a great keeper who knew how to care for the animals and actually cared about them. However, in 1835, the menagerie was finally closed and the animals were moved to the London Zoo after concerns with animal welfare were risen. Interestingly enough, despite no longer having an active menagerie, animals have been and are still received as gifts by the monarchy to this day. Queen Elizabeth II has received sloths and jaguars from Brazil and an elephant. Today, the Tower of London is one of London's most visited attractions. In fact, it is one of the few paid attractions in London as it hasn't been funded by the government. There were approximately 2.98 million visitors in 2019 alone. If you were to visit today, you could see an exhibition on the working collection of the crown jewels. You could see several historical objects used by the British monarchy in royal coronation ceremonies. You could see instruments of torture, allegedly, used throughout the history's dark past, although some speculate it wasn't quite the torture chamber it was made out to be, and that its history as a den of torture was likely exaggerated, as well as the ravens that we'll talk about in a second. There are more than two, but two that I'm going to talk about. Interesting traditions regarding the Tower of London that I have yet to mention, but that I definitely want to touch on. The first is the yeoman warders, or better known as the beef eaters. They were first mentioned around 500 years ago when the yeoman of the guard was created by King Henry VIII. The yeoman of the guard is the personal guard of the monarchy. In 1509, King Henry VIII decided to leave 12 of his men behind to guard the tower in his absence, and thus the yeoman warders sprang into existence. These men and women are now different from the yeomen of the guard and simply stay at the tower versus acting as the Queen's personal bodyguards. This post was either handed down through the family or sold until 1826, when the Duke of Wellington, who was then the constable of the tower, decided it was from then on to be held by non-commissioned officers of the household cavalry, foot guards, and infantry by the way of regiment recommendation. Today, they are required to have at least 22 years of military service. They are the guarders of the tower and of the crown jewels. Back in the day, the yeoman warders also wrangled the menagerie. Today, they also act as tour guides. There are 12 beefeaters always on duty out of a pool of about 37 men and women. The beefeaters are famous for their ceremony of the keys, a tradition long standing for over 700 years. It all started in the 1300s when Edward III arrived at the tower to find it unlocked and wide open. After imprisoning the then constable of the tower, Edward III overhauled security with a price tag of around 30,000 euros in today's money at the castle, demanding the castle be locked down at sunset and reopened at sunrise. Thus began the ceremony of the keys. Since 1826, the sunset has been switched out for 10 p.m. sharp, and the ceremony begins promptly at 9:53 p.m. every single night. The only exception to this being one night on December 29, 1940, when a bomb was apparently dropped on the tower. While the chief yeoman warder was knocked off his feet, the ceremony still took place, albeit a little bit later than usual. During the ceremony, a sentry yells, "Halt, who comes there?" To which the chief yeoman warder replies, "The keys." The sentry then asks, "Whose keys?" To which the yeoman warder responds, "Queen Elizabeth's keys." Finally, the sentry says, "Pass them, all's well." Both the outer gate and inner gate are locked by the chief yeoman warder in conjunction with the watchman. Right before 10 o'clock, the chief says, "God preserve Queen Elizabeth." At exactly 10 o'clock, the guard plays his bugle to the tune of the last post, and the sentry answers Amen. Finally, the chief takes the keys to the Queen's representative at the tower, the resident governor. Most intriguing is that the exchange has remained the same throughout time, with only the names of the monarch being switched out. You can actually see the ceremony as part of an attraction if you go and visit the Tower of London. The other last and interesting thing I wanted to mention is the ravens. There are a flock of ravens in permanent residence at the tower. Legend says that if the 6 ravens leave the tower, the kingdom will fall. Currently, there are 7 ravens in residence at the tower, so one can act as a spare, and can be seen as part of the attraction if you were to visit. They are named Jubilee, Harris, Grip, Rocky, Aaron, Poppy, and Merlina. Quite the gambit of names. These are cared for by the Yeoman Warder Raven Master. The Raven Master today carefully manages the ravens by sometimes clipping their flight wings to keep them from roaming too far. Sometimes, though, they do roam and they do get into trouble. The raven Munin once flew to Greenwich and was returned 7 days later. George, a mischievous raven, was dismissed for eating television aerials. Grog was last seen outside of an East End pub. As you can see, the Tower of London has an illustrious past, making it all the more intriguing. I can definitely see why it's a hub of tourism, and it's definitely on my list of must-see places. I'd be most interested in seeing the graffiti in the Beauchamp Tower and the ceremony of the keys. What would you be most interested in seeing? Let me know down below. So that's it for today's video on the somewhat spooky topic of the Tower of London. The next video is going to be on another somewhat spooky topic. It's going to be on a person, and it's going to be the Countess of Bathory. So I'll see you then. Capone.